I never thought I'd hear my own son call someone I love a parasite, but that's exactly what happened across my Thanksgiving table last year. I'm 51 years old, a civil engineer who spent 3 decades building bridges, both literal and metaphorical, and I raised 2 kids who I thought understood the difference between grief and cruelty. My wife Linda died 4 years ago after a brutal fight with cancer, and for 3 years after that, I existed more than I lived. I went through the motions at work, came home to an empty house that still smelled faintly of her perfume, and told myself that this half-life was what loyalty looked like. My daughter Jennifer was 28, my son Michael was 25, and both of them seemed to think my role was to be their eternally grieving father, a monument to their mother's memory rather than a man who still had years ahead of him. Then I met Rebecca at a community planning meeting, and something I thought had died with Linda flickered back to life. Rebecca was 43, a high school math teacher with laugh lines around her eyes and a directness I found refreshing after years of people treating me like I was made of glass. We started with coffee, then dinners, then weekend hikes where we'd talk about everything except the losses we'd both endured. She'd been widowed young, no children, and had built a life that was full and purposeful without needing someone else to complete it. That's what drew me to her, the fact that she wanted me but didn't need me, that she saw me as Nathan the man, not Nathan the widower. 6 months in, I knew I wanted to marry her, but I also knew my kids would struggle with it. I tried to introduce them slowly, carefully, but Jennifer's eyes went cold the first time she shook Rebecca's hand, and Michael barely managed a nod. They were polite in that aggressive way that makes politeness feel like an insult, and I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I married Rebecca anyway, in a small ceremony at the courthouse with 2 friends as witnesses, because I was done asking permission to live my life from children who were adults themselves. I told Jennifer and Michael a week before, not asking for their blessing, but informing them of my decision, and the silence on the other end of those phone calls felt like condemnation. Jennifer came by the house the day after the wedding, let herself in with her old key, and walked through the rooms like she was documenting a crime scene. She stopped in front of a photo of Linda I'd moved from the mantel to my office, her expression a mixture of grief and accusation. "You replaced her," she said quietly. "Not even a year of dating, and you just replaced her like she never mattered." I tried to explain that 4 years wasn't nothing, that Linda herself had made me promise not to spend the rest of my life alone. But Jennifer just shook her head and left, and I watched her car disappear down the street with a heaviness in my stomach. Michael was worse because he was louder about it. He showed up at my office unannounced, walked past my assistant like she didn't exist, and closed the door with enough force to rattle the engineering certificates on my wall. He wanted to know if I'd lost my mind, if I understood that Rebecca was obviously after my money, if I realized how humiliating this was for the family. I sat behind my desk, the same desk where I'd reviewed structural calculations that kept buildings standing and bridges from collapsing, and tried to apply that same logical precision to my son's rage. I asked him what money he thought I had that would be worth chasing. I reminded him that I was a civil engineer, not a hedge fund manager, that my salary was comfortable but hardly extravagant. He didn't care about logic. "She's younger than you," he said, like that was evidence of some crime, "and she's moving into Mom's house." I corrected him gently. "It's my house, Michael. It stopped being Mom's house when she died." Rebecca handled it better than I did, which shouldn't have surprised me given that she'd spent 20 years managing teenagers who thought they knew everything. She never complained about the cold shoulders at family events or the way Jennifer would ask me questions and ignore her entirely, as if Rebecca was invisible. She never pointed out that Michael called me constantly, but would end the conversation abruptly if she answered the phone. She just kept showing up, kept being kind, kept living her life with a quiet dignity that made my children's behavior look increasingly petty. But I could see it wearing on her. The way her smile would falter when another invitation to a grandchild's birthday party came addressed only to me. The careful neutrality in her voice when she'd suggest maybe I should visit the kids alone. I'd lie awake some nights, Rebecca asleep beside me, and wonder if I'd been selfish, if loving her was somehow betraying the memory of loving Linda, if my children's unhappiness was the price I'd have to pay for my own. Then came Thanksgiving, and I decided I was done letting my kids dictate the terms of my life. I told them we were hosting, that Rebecca and I would cook, and that they were welcome at our table if they could manage basic civility. Jennifer arrived with her husband Tom and their two kids, her face already set in that expression of martyrdom she'd perfected over the past 18 months. Michael came alone, his wife conveniently sick with something that sounded suspiciously diplomatic. We made it through appetizers with forced small talk about work and weather, through the first course with uncomfortable silence broken only by the kids' chatter, and then, over turkey and stuffing, Michael decided to detonate the fragile peace. He asked Rebecca, very casually, what she did before she trapped his father into marriage. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my grandchildren's eyes go wide, watched Tom shift uncomfortably, watched Jennifer's expression flicker between satisfaction and uncertainty. Rebecca set down her fork with a precision that suggested she was choosing not to throw it, and smiled. I taught high school math, she said, her voice pleasant and even. Still do, actually. Advanced calculus, AP statistics, some remedial algebra for students who struggle with the basics. Michael laughed, actually laughed, and said something about how convenient it must be to go from a teacher's salary to living in a paid-off house in a nice neighborhood. Jennifer jumped in then, her voice taking on that edge of concerned daughter that I recognized as barely concealed hostility. She just wanted to make sure I was being careful, that I understood there were people who targeted vulnerable widowers, that it wasn't too late to protect my assets. I felt something snap inside me, some final thread of patience that had been fraying for months. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood Linda and I had installed 20 years ago, and told my children that if they couldn't show respect in my home, they were welcome to leave. The silence that followed was devastating. Jennifer's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she had nightmares. But then the mask came back up, and she was gathering her children and her coat. Michael just stared at me like I'd struck him, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Tom, bless him, tried to mediate, but I shook my head. I'd spent 4 years trying to be the father they needed, the keeper of their mother's memory, the unchanged constant in their changing lives, and I was done. I loved them, would always love them, but I loved Rebecca too, and I was choosing both my past and my future, not sacrificing one for the other. They left, Jennifer crying, Michael angry, the kids confused, and Rebecca and I sat at that half-empty table surrounded by food that nobody felt like eating anymore. She reached across and took my hand, and I held on like I was drowning. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quiet in a way that felt like mourning. No calls from Jennifer, no texts from Michael, just silence that stretched and deepened until I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated, if standing up for Rebecca had cost me my children permanently. I threw myself into work, a new bridge project that required complex calculations and long hours, anything to avoid coming home to a phone that didn't ring. Rebecca noticed, of course. She suggested I reach out, try to build bridges the way I did professionally, but I was too angry and too hurt. I'd spent their whole lives putting them first, sacrificing promotions that would have required relocation, turning down projects that would have meant months away from home. And this was how they repaid that devotion. By treating the woman I loved like she was a con artist, by reducing my grief and recovery to something shameful. I knew Linda would have been furious with them, would have sat them down and explained in her no-nonsense way that love wasn't finite, that me loving Rebecca didn't mean I loved their mother less. December brought the first crack in the silence. Jennifer sent a text, brief and formal, asking if she could come by to talk. I agreed, and she showed up on a Saturday morning looking exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from sleepless nights spent wrestling with your own conscience. We sat in the kitchen, Rebecca conveniently finding errands that needed running, and Jennifer apologized in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear it. She said she'd been angry and scared, that seeing me with Rebecca had felt like losing her mother all over again, that she knew she'd been unfair but didn't know how to stop. I listened, and I heard the grief underneath the words, the little girl who missed her mom underneath the grown woman who'd said terrible things. I told her I forgave her, but that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that she owed Rebecca an apology too, and that things couldn't go back to the way they were because the way they were had been slowly killing me. Michael took longer. It was mid-January when he finally called, his voice stiff with the effort of swallowing his pride. He didn't apologize exactly, just said he'd been thinking about what I'd said, about respect and family, and that maybe he'd been out of line. It wasn't the groveling I might have wanted, But it was something, and I'd learned long ago that engineering solutions required working with the materials you had, not the ones you wished for. We agreed to meet for lunch, just the two of us, at a diner halfway between his office and mine. He looked older somehow, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time in months. This man who was my son, but also a stranger who'd revealed a capacity for cruelty I hadn't known existed. We talked about work, about his wife, about everything except the elephant sitting in the booth with us, until finally I asked him point blank if he was ready to accept Rebecca as part of my life. He didn't answer right away, just pushed hash browns around his plate and avoided my eyes. Finally, he said he didn't know if he could ever be happy about it, but he understood that it wasn't his choice to make. It wasn't the wholehearted acceptance I'd hoped for, but it was honest, and I respected honesty. I told him about Rebecca then, really told him, about her intelligence and her kindness, about how she challenged me to be better, about the way she'd held me through panic attacks after Linda died that I'd hidden from everyone else. I told him about the night I'd broken down in her kitchen, sobbing like a child, and how she'd just sat with me until the storm passed, not trying to fix it or minimize it, just bearing witness to my pain. I watched something shift in Michael's face, some recognition that maybe he didn't know everything about grief and healing, that maybe his father's emotional life was more complex than he'd given credit for. February brought a thaw, tentative and fragile, but real. Jennifer invited us to dinner, both of us, and actually made conversation with Rebecca about her students and teaching methods. Michael sent a group text that included Rebecca for the first time, just something about a funny thing his kid had said, but the inclusion felt monumental. We started rebuilding, slowly, like engineers reinforcing a damaged foundation, checking each step before adding weight. Rebecca was patient through all of it, never demanding acknowledgement of how poorly she'd been treated, never keeping score of slights and insults, just quietly being herself until my children couldn't help but see her clearly. I watched Jennifer laugh at one of Rebecca's stories about a student who tried to prove the Pythagorean theorem using sandwich triangles, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since Thanksgiving. Then, in early March, something happened that changed everything. I had a heart attack, a moderate one, while reviewing blueprints at my office. One moment I was checking load calculations, the next I was on the floor with crushing pain in my chest and my assistant screaming for someone to call an ambulance. I remember the ceiling tiles of my office, the fluorescent lights that needed replacing, the strange clarity that comes when you think you might be dying. I remember thinking about Linda, wondering if I was about to see her again, and then thinking about Rebecca, about how unfair it would be to put her through this loss after she'd already buried one husband. The paramedics arrived, and there was a chaotic blur of being loaded into an ambulance, of monitors and oxygen, and someone telling me to stay calm. And then nothing until I woke up in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and Rebecca holding my hand. She'd been there the whole time, through the emergency surgery to place a stent, through the anxious hours of recovery, sleeping in a chair beside my bed when the nurses finally forced her to rest. But what struck me, what made me understand something fundamental, was that she'd called my children immediately. Not after she'd processed it, not when she was sure I'd be okay, but the moment the doctors said I was stable. She'd sat in that waiting room and held Jennifer while she cried, had explained the medical details to Michael when he arrived pale and shaking, had made sure my kids could see me as soon as the doctors allowed it. Jennifer told me later, her voice thick with tears and shame, that Rebecca had been the one to keep them calm, to explain what the surgery entailed, to reassure them that I was strong and stubborn and would be fine. Michael admitted that he'd seen her face when the doctor came out with updates, had seen real fear and love there, not calculation or pretense. The recovery was slow and frustrating, weeks of cardiac rehab and dietary restrictions, and having to ask for help with things I'd done independently my entire adult life. Rebecca took a leave of absence from teaching to help me, and I hated needing her like that, hated the vulnerability and dependence. But she never made me feel weak, never treated me like I was fragile, just matter-of-factly adjusted our life to accommodate my new limitations while pushing me to do the work the doctors ordered. Jennifer started coming by twice a week, bringing her kids, helping with errands. Michael showed up on Saturdays to handle yard work and repairs I couldn't manage yet. And slowly, I watched them watch Rebecca, saw them notice the way she anticipated my needs without hovering. The way she pushed me to walk farther each day while respecting when I was genuinely exhausted. The way she loved me without making my heart attack the defining feature of our relationship. One evening in late April, I came downstairs from a nap to find Rebecca and Jennifer sitting at the kitchen table together, really talking, not just making polite conversation. They didn't notice me at first, and I heard Jennifer say something about being sorry, about being so focused on her own grief that she couldn't see what her father needed. Rebecca's response was quiet but clear. Your dad loved your mother completely, she said. Nothing about him loving me changes that. I'm not replacing her because she's irreplaceable. I'm just trying to be a good partner to him in this phase of his life, and maybe, if you'll let me, a friend to you. I watched Jennifer reach across the table and squeeze Rebecca's hand, watched tears run down my daughter's face, and felt a weight I'd been carrying since Linda's death finally begin to lift. This was what healing looked like, messy and slow and imperfect, but real. Michael's turning point came during a fishing trip he organized, just him and me like we used to do when he was a kid. We sat on the dock of a lake 2 hours from home, lines in the water, not catching anything but not really trying to. He asked me, haltingly, if I'd ever felt guilty about being happy with Rebecca. I told him the truth, that I'd felt guilty every single day at first, that sometimes I still did, that loving someone new after losing Linda felt like a betrayal even though my head knew it wasn't. But I also told him that Linda had made me promise, in those final weeks when we both knew she was dying, that I wouldn't turn myself into a living memorial to her. She'd wanted me to live, really live, not just exist in the shadow of what we'd had. Michael was quiet for a long time, then said he wished he'd understood that sooner, that he'd wasted over a year being angry when he could have been getting to know Rebecca. I told him it wasn't too late, that families were like bridges, you could reinforce them even after damage, make them stronger than they were before. Now, a year later, things aren't perfect because life isn't perfect, but they're good. Rebecca and Jennifer text regularly about books and recipes and teaching strategies. Michael's kids call her Miss Rebecca and ask her for help with their math homework. We have family dinners where everyone actually talks to everyone, where Rebecca's stories get laughs and her opinions get considered, where she's not invisible or tolerated but genuinely included. I look at my children sometimes and see glimpses of the people Linda and I tried to raise. People who can grow and admit mistakes and choose love over pride. I look at Rebecca and see the future I thought I'd lost. Proof that life can surprise you even when you think your story's mostly written. And late at night, when Rebecca's asleep beside me and the house is quiet, I think about Linda and I hope she knows that I kept my promise, that I'm living fully and loving deeply, and that the bridge between grief and joy, like all the best bridges I've ever designed, is stronger than it looks.